Yeah, so I was asking about, I don't know where I dropped out there, but I was asking about Plato's argument for
Yeah.
the existence of universals. And he said it was
Yeah.
something like, this is very bare bones, but it was, if they are knowable, then they exist. Universals are knowable, therefore they exist. Isn't
It's
that
in the
like,
Meno. He has a better argument than that.
yeah, okay. All right.
It's in the Meno if you want to
Yeah,
know it
okay.
exactly.
Got
It's
it. So I
something
gotta
about
go.
the soul, how the soul relates to the noble things of the world, something to that
Okay.
effect.
Okay, I got to read the Meno then. I think
Yeah.
that same pattern of argument, I saw that come up in later philosophy as well. Whenever anyone tries to prove God, they say, well, he's conceivable, therefore he exists. And it's baffling, but I got to read the Meno and find out.
It's not that bad, but it isn't a very strong argument.
Yeah.
It's not as bad as that, but it's kind of like questionable. It's almost like what you just described, but
Yeah.
a bit more than that.
I'm reading through economics in one lesson. And one thing I'm thinking about, he's always like complaining, oh, people can't see the chain of reasoning in economics, so they're not able to see the impact of a policy on anything other than the immediate group or anything other than in the immediate short term and blah, blah, blah. Like, okay, so what role does economics play in anyone's life then if it seems like you can't apply it to your life or people don't care about the reasoning that he's going through?
I think the basics, the how would I describe it? Like holistic thinking. It gives you principles of holistic thinking. So you could think of the system of something whenever you face an issue or a problem. I mean, that applies to like, I don't know, studying a science or starting a business or even just thinking about your health, is pointing attention to how one small thing affects big things.
Couldn't I
That you
say the
can't
same
think.
about every other subject?
For the most part, I think. I think economics in particular is more about, there's a lot more about values.
Right.
As opposed to say biology.
Yeah.
Is more about like maybe health or ethics. It depends what area you want to focus on. But I think ethics is, I mean, economics, I think, especially with politics and discussion of values.
All right. Okay, let's go to an aphorism. Once the decision has been made, close your ear even to the best counter argument. Sign of a good character. Thus an occasional will to stupidity.
Yeah, I think that's just irony. He's just being funny. Like, oh, you had the strength to, your strength to not change your mind, but you're also stupid.
Right.
You do that.
Right. Will to stupidity.
Yes. It's not by accident. It's almost like they want to be stupid.
Right. Let's look at the future of science. To the man who works and searches in it, science gives much pleasure. To the man who learns its results very little. Okay.
Yeah, what's your thoughts on it?
I'm still reading it.
Okay.
I need to read it more. I didn't quite follow. All I got was, if you're working within science, it's more pleasurable. But if you're outside learning its results without knowing what was required to get those results, there's less pleasure. And then in the same way, you learn the multiplication tables, but they're just brute forced. It's just brute force products of thought that you're memorizing. So that's not interesting. It's boring. And then So science over time becomes less joyous because what was a new and undiscovered result becomes everyday and commonplace, and it casts suspicions on religion, blah, blah, blah.
I would interpret it
Then
more
I didn't get the connection to the greatest pleasure, which mankind was
well.
itself. Yeah. What do you make of that? I don't know what to, apart from that little thing I said, I don't know what I'd make of this.
Well, to the man who works and searches in it, say the neurologist who cuts up neurons.
Yeah.
They're looking for the answers. They don't yet know the answer. And that can be pleasurable. I mean, that's a pleasurable thing.
Right.
To the man who learns his results. But when
Yeah.
you get the answer, the mystery goes away. Like, it's not as pleasurable when you know the answer. You don't need to
Right.
look anymore. It's like
Right.
knowing the spoilers of a murder mystery. If you know who did it, it's like, it's not as fun anymore. So it's like that, I think he's saying. And since all scientific knowledge becomes everyday and commonplace, you're bound to lose that mystery, right?
Right.
That would make sense.
Yeah. Just like same with humor, right? If you have a joke
Yeah,
explained
that
to you,
too.
it's not as funny. But then, so what's the deal with then the greatest source of pleasure to which mankind, oh, so he's talking about science actually. He's saying even science is impoverished.
Yes, if we ignore yeah, he's saying that science is, even just as a way of exploration, is impoverished. Especially because it accounts down on everything else like religion and art. If science does that, not only is it, well, he's suggesting that science makes even less joy if, let me restart over. That didn't work. Now, if science produces ever less joy in itself, okay, so the more we learn, the less joy we get in time. It takes ever greater joy in casting suspicion. So he's adding on to that. So, okay, that happens. No big deal. We lose the mystery. But he's saying something more. If it also casts suspicion on metaphysics, religion, art, then the greatest source of pleasure, which maybe is art. I think he's referring to
Maybe
art.
it's not science, because why would he say
Yeah.
the greatest source of pleasure is
Yeah, it's
science?
art, but that impoverishes art. You don't want to cast suspicion on religion and art. A science that does that only destroys the pleasure of life. That's what
I
he's
thought,
suggesting.
oh, okay. Based on what you said, I interpreted it now differently. I thought maybe art is impoverished.
Yeah, I guess you're right, actually. Art becomes impoverished when science casts doubt. So science, despite the mystery it brings, can also impoverish art if you're not careful anyway.
And what would be his alternative though? Like I've heard that view. It was Feynman actually talked about it when he said his artist friend said he wants mystery. He doesn't want to know how the flower works or what the cells do or what the atoms do. He thinks that makes life boring and unbearable. And Feynman said it actually makes it more interesting and more beautiful. And so what is,
Yeah.
It sounds like Nietzsche's taking this view that the artist took when his Feynman's artist friend took, right?
Yeah.
What is the alternative?
Well,
though?
Nietzsche's saying that, well, if you're going to do science, we got to not cast doubt on art. And how would we do that? I guess
Right.
take into account the whole individual, not just, oh, this thing they do, or disinterested or objective in scare quotes, like objective, like you're not part of it at all. You're separate and detached. That's the thing you have to avoid. Don't be separate and detached. Integrate it in your life or make it part of your life. The scientist can be an artist at the same time. Aristotle probably was. He probably
From a
did
what? An
artistic
artist.
things.
Oh, an artist. Okay, got
I mean, he probably wrote dialogues too, like Plato. We just don't have them. Or Da Vinci, even. Like, he did science and art. They were not detached. Science did not detract from his art. It's that kind of attitude, an integrated attitude about like life and what you do. It's not just simply contemplation on its own.
right. Do you think that's true? That once you understand something, it's no longer how do you describe it? He says it no longer brings you pleasure. Is the pleasure in the tension between what you know and don't know? Like, because it's true in a sense. I get it. Like, you explain humor, it's not funny. You read a book once, it's this is not always true with a book, by the way. Like, you can still gain pleasure a second time if it's a deep
Yeah.
reading, but then I guess it's the pleasure of discovering something you didn't discover before, right? So yeah,
At least
do you think
it's
yeah,
different, or sometimes it is less. I mean,
yeah,
you
yeah,
find
yeah,
new
it is.
mysteries though quite easily,
Yeah,
and you can still have wonder about it, which I guess in a way you can find pleasure, but it's in something else. It's not the
right,
science itself, it's not the answer per se, but the recognition of how integrated, how everything operates in a deterministic way.
right,
Not deterministic, but determinate, like I mentioned before. Like,
right,
there's a reason things happen. You can explain things. That itself is, I think, pleasurable to know and recognize. You could have like a comfort in that, to know that there is a reality that does what it does and is knowable and can be understood, or at least we can make our own decisions and make our own way within it.
and then
Things like that.
there's a psychology that would think that it's better not to know. Like, there's pleasure in the unknowable. Can you have
I
pleasure in
bet
the
some just
unknowable
pleasure. The sheer unknowability of
of
something.
something? Yeah, like
I mean,
the
if
artist who
somebody
doesn't want to
thought,
know about the
um,
inner workings of the flower.
well, Socrates would say no,
Yeah,
for sure. Can you know if you said something was knowable, could that be pleasurable? I guess if you find pleasure in randomness, but why would that be? I would question that personally.
yeah,
Are
okay,
they, is it some issue that they don't want responsibility? Or do they just not like to think? I would wonder that first.
right. Okay, interesting. I read this in a book called it's about the media. Trust me, I'm lying. It's about the media. It's written by a guy who manipulates the media to market products. And there was he mentioned a study that was done on like what kind of headlines get you the most page views, which is what a lot of the incentives are built on, getting traffic, because that's how you get paid. And so he quoted this article, and they found out in this study, not article, in this study, they found out that the most powerful predictor of virality in the news is how much anger an article evokes. So they categorized they categorized articles by whether they're positive or negative, and the articles that have like intense positive emotions evoke more interest, but the ones that evoke intense negative emotions or anger evoke the most interest. Like, they managed to measure it and put it in statistical terms, and it was like a few standard deviations more or something like that. And I've heard this a lot of the time said, like, oh, we're evolved to feel negative emotions more strongly. We're evolved to feel the negative and be more pessimistic, because in evolution, this is all just like armchair speculation. I have no idea what people are talking about, but it is a thing that people say that, like, we're evolved to feel the negative, to feel pain more than pleasure. And what do you make of all of that? And this research, which seems to confirm that people are more motivated by negative emotions. Even the popularity and the traffic an article garners depends on how negative it is.
First, I just want to know how they define their terms. That's always my first question.
Right.
What do they mean by these terms?
Yeah.
What do they mean by anger or negative? And yeah, you can, the way you portray things matters. People have known that for thousands of years. Even way before Aristotle. He wrote rhetoric. I mean, not that he came up with a new way to look at emotions, but he knew that emotions mattered. And he analyzed them. What we want to aim to do is aim at understanding what produces these emotions. Is it just easier to produce anger? Like, is it easier for the person writing? Or is it actually that anger is the driving force? Are there other emotions we could do? I mean, it's hard to, do you want to use pity? Would that work better? Pity would work well, and I might call that a negative emotion. I'm not sure. I mean, what is a negative emotion? That's why I think it matters. I mean, like pity does a lot.
I would say negative emotion is one which brings you pain. A positive one is one which brings you pleasure. And both can compel action, but the argument is that the negative compels more action.
Well, the negative, that could make sense. But what would positive emotions be? I mean, just as an example. Not that they're counterexamples, but how do we compare?
Love, happiness, satisfaction, excitement. Like excitement about some new technology or excitement about potential change in law that'll affect your work, or I don't know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then negative would be laws that negatively affect you, or someone doing something you think is wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, I think anger, is a consequence. It's easy to bring about. I think is more of the reason. Personally, I think it's easier to make a person feel like that you're belittling them, that you're saying something bad about them or the people they care about. It's harder to bring about a pleasure, I think.
That's interesting. What's that Tolstoy quote?
I don't know.
Yeah, let me find it. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. But that's actually that would make the case for the opposite, where it would be harder to reach people through their anger. It'd be easier to reach them through their excitement and happiness. So that's like, I guess that's a counter to that. But
yeah, it is a hard question. I don't really know what I'd say either. I think a lot of it depends on the skill of the writer.
What do you make of the claims of the fact that we feel pain more intensely than we do? And this has all been, I haven't looked into the research because I'll just overwhelm myself with crap. But yeah, it's been shown that we feel negative emotions more strongly than positive, and that we are evolved to feel that because, that's what would save us from the monsters or the lions or the dinosaurs or whatever they think it was evolutionarily. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Never really thought about it, whether one's more predominant, negative or positive. I mean, I think it's about equal, I would guess. I mean, you need pleasure too. I would say it's more pleasure that gets you to do things. I mean, displeasure works, but depends the power of it. It is powerful, but I'm trying to think why that would be. Like, why would it seem more powerful? I don't know. Well, I think pleasure is more powerful though.
Yeah, so a lot of people would disagree with you because I've had this discussion with people. I don't know. I think that my question would be, one, I'd need to go through the studies and like you mentioned, what are their terms? How do they do the studies? Which, by the way, at some point we should do. Like, you're gonna remember we discussed like how do you go through an academic study and get a good idea of how solid it is. But then, so putting that aside, I'd say the question is, how do you differentiate what's your personal psychology by your own choice, as opposed to what, and especially what's a cultural norm, as opposed to what's actually human qua human? Because I know there's a lot of people who are anxious and have all kinds of psychological issues for whatever reason. It doesn't necessarily need to be dominant, but it's a significant portion of the population, I guess. And so then those ideas just become rationalization. Like they seem plausible and true because that's what the person experiences, but they still haven't answered the question of how do you differentiate what is biological and what is human, what is biological, human qua human versus what is your personal psychology. And a certain kind of personal psychology can be dominant in a given culture at any time, right? So
Yeah.
I don't have an answer to that, but I've heard
What I
people say that a
do
lot.
is don't use myself as the concrete evidence for a psychological conclusion. I keep myself separate, like as in the material I use is other people. What do they do? What general observations can I make? I only use myself to the extent that could I fit into that too? Am I counter to it? I don't use myself as positive evidence, but as I only use myself as my experiences should fit in with what I generalize. But if I experience something different than what I generalize, then something must be missing about my explanation.
Right.
Because I am in the category of human. So anything that's true of me should be true of a person. Or at least anything true of a person, I mean, in general, it's true of me.
Yeah.
If it's not true of me, then something's wrong with the theory.
Yeah.
I don't use myself as the theory. I never use myself as a basis other than maybe to spring out from to get curiosity, but I don't use it as a starting point ever.
Yeah, okay. But that's you being objective. I think most people that I've spoken to, it seems like they think it's true.
Yes.
And they hold on to and talk about that theory probably because they themselves experience that. But then it doesn't seem to work to challenge them to go, how do you differentiate what's, that doesn't work. So
cognitive bias is difficult. That's just cognitive bias. That's one of the hardest things to break, I think.
Yeah, I've asked people that, and it doesn't seem to, I also don't have in that argument, I definitely experience negative emotions. And I would say sometimes it's true for me that the negative is more intense than the positive, but I don't take that as evidence because I know there's other there can easily be other factors at play, right? Like I mentioned culture before, and the philosophy you inherit through the culture. And so, but I think like you point out, a lot of people must take it as true. Maybe those are some articles we can, not articles, but research papers we can try and squeeze through and see if we can identify.
That's usually a good topic, like pleasure and learning.
Right.
Like dopamine, people say oh, it's addiction, or they talk about addiction a lot too much. They talk about the notion of pleasure, but they abstract it wrong, or they think about it wrongly, or just hard to think about too.
The difficulty is without a good framework, and I'm starting to realize this, without a very solid, well-integrated, thought-out, systematic framework, basic framework for thinking about reality and things that come up, you can't contend with the complexity, and it's too much. Like, how could you possibly go through imagine picking up an article and then you've got to start deducing all their different terms and you've also got to live a life, right? So it becomes without that basic framework, that's impossible. You just can't do it. You've got to go into you got to go into your, what did Nietzsche describe the columbrium? You've got to go into your little hole in a columbrium and just stay in there.
Yeah. I see why people would do that. That makes Nietzsche's observation that much more interesting. They want to go into the little hole because it makes everything sensible to them in their Apollonian columbrium.
Well, I don't know if most people even build a columbrium. He talked about spinning fine webs and so on. I think most people don't even build a columbrium because it's so hard.
That's true.
They will go into one corner of a columbrium.
Yes. And I think one reason people maybe don't see pleasure as deep a motivator as say Aristotle did. Like Aristotle thought everything was like people sought pleasure. The good is pleasure. If you attain the good is pleasurable. That's what he thought. Like, so you would only do something for the pleasure.
Right.
Like avoiding something is not really like why you do anything or what the nature of man is. And because the Greeks were more about passion. They're more about the Dionysian in a way. Like before Aristotle, they were all about these crazy festivals. Like they were really into pleasure and they didn't see it as bad. So it's a different way of looking at everything compared to this sort of post-Christian secular world we live in, where pleasure is questionable. Like people question pleasure. And I think that's maybe where that idea stems from. Not so much science as much as the culture.
Right. Captured in something like, bah, what's happiness?
Yes.
So you could say that the Greeks were value driven then, because if you're driven by something positives, you're driven by values, versus by fear, you're driven by disvalue, right? That's not value. Yeah. That's just fear of loss.
Right.
Which is a fundamentally fundamental difference in basic motivation of a person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Why is it that the Greeks wrote tragedies then? They were that was the birth of tragedy. Hey, didn't Nietzsche write a book called The Birth of Tragedy?
Yes. It isn't this conflict. I mean, the conflict itself can be pleasurable because you resolve the conflict in the tragedy. That's part of what's pleasurable about it. That there's a coming to relaxation of the conflict, a cleansing away of the tense feeling of it as a consequence of what happens. And the characters are usually imperfect, flawed. They're almost the moral ideal, but fail in some. They mean to do well, but they make a mistake and fail. Like Achilles.
Is this in the tragedies? Is this what you say happens?
Well, that's epic. A tragedy would be like Oedipus, where he accidentally murders his father, I think it is.
Right.
He means to do well, but a bad thing happened. And throughout the process of the tragedy, you discover you resolve your internal conflict, the pain you feel about the bad things happening. That's why they wrote tragedy, because it resolves some sort of conflict.
By dying though? By people dying and crying?
Yes. It's kind of absurd in a way, but that's how the Greeks were.
So how does that fit into this pleasure-driven, value-driven culture then? It's such an interesting combination. Then you get the birth of tragedy, but then I don't have anything to compare it to with uniquely Christian art, but it's just
at least Aristotle said that the tragedy provides a pleasure. I mean, it's the writing itself provides a pleasure, like the experience of it.
Right.
When Nietzsche goes birth of tragedy, it's the birth of the conflict between a passion and the reasoned thoughts, a conflict between the two, a tension.
Yeah, there's that tension in Greek culture a lot. Hey, world of appearances and the world of the reality.
Yeah, they overcome, and the point of thinking is to overcome that, and that provides pleasure. When you overcome the tension, you attain the good, and it's therefore pleasurable.
So the reason overcomes the emotion, would you say?
Probably not, but that your life resolves the conflict. That seems like a very Greek thing. Tragedy is like a resolution of the conflict. It resolves the tension. As bad as it might be, there's a unity between the two in a way that they can't exist without each other. That you can't have the Dionysian without the Apollonian. You need both.
I'm just trying to find you an Augustine quote right now, because we're talking about Greeks being value-driven, reason-driven, pleasure-driven, and yet they get tragedies, and I'll see if I'll find you. Okay, let's see if I can.
It's like, why do people like Breaking Bad so much? I mean, they find it so enjoyable to watch, but it is a tragedy.
All right, this is ridiculous if you read him. This is what I think of when I think of tragedy. It's just on and on and on and on about, I'll show you in a second. I found it. Okay. For at their hands we suffer robbery, captivity, chains, imprisonment, exile, torture, mutilation, loss of sight, the violation of chastity to satisfy the lust of the oppressor, and many other dreadful evils. What numberless casualties threaten our bodies from without, extremes of heat or cold, storms, flood, inundations, lightning, thunder, hail, earthquakes, houses falling, or from the stumbling or shine.
This one.
It's like, but isn't this what tragedy is? So why?
No,
how do you get
not
this?
The Greek tragedy.
Okay.
In the Greek tragedy, the person who's the victim of tragedy brought it on themselves to some extent.
Okay.
That if it wasn't for their actions, nothing would have happened.
Right.
Oedipus kills his father because of actions he took before.
Right.
It wasn't random or unpredictable, but caused by Oedipus himself. He brought in his own tragedy. His mistake, an honest mistake, led to his downfall. And I know that might seem like random. It is a bit fatalistic, but that's also part of the Greek way of thought. That you just take for granted, like, that's what happened. You do your best, mistakes can happen, and that's sometimes what happens. It is a bit fatalistic there. Sometimes you can't help but wait what's going to happen. But it's not like Augustine where nothing is knowable, Emily. God can say anything. Like, even as the viewer, you could see something's about to happen. So it's tragedy in a different sense.
Maybe it's just the case that, like all cultures, it's mixed, because you can look at their statues and compare them to statues from the Dark Ages or Middle Ages, and you see you definitely see a difference in the way people are portrayed. But then they also have plays that are tragedies, and that's like a common thread running throughout, let's say, ancient societies where they don't have a sense of control over the world.
Yeah, there's a lot of Greek tragedies.
Yeah. Okay.
And Aristotle even just like in Poetics, he talks about like the good ones and the bad ones. Right. There's definitely a different quality, even by his standards of, like he says, a good tragedy should be a flawed person who didn't bring on the actions himself. That's usually what makes for a good tragedy, right? By his reasoning. Right. Things like that. Like, it's not what you might think of as tragedy, like, oh, it's a tragedy that in a random accident that you lost your entire family in a plane crash. Like, Aristotle would even say that's not a tragedy, probably. Not in the artistic sense, like, because accidental and random isn't caused by the essential nature of the person acting, of the main character.
Would you say tragedy is malevolent?
I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I mean, We the Living is a tragedy too.
Right.
I would say.
Right. So it reflects, maybe it's something like, given the morality of the culture, it reflects an inevitability, just like, if two people can't get married.
It depends on the plot's arranged. It depends on the plot, I think.
Okay. I have to go through some of these tragedies. All right.
Yeah. Even just some Wikipedia, like a synopsis of Oedipus and some others. They're just good to know about.
Did you get pleasure reading the play though, or like going through it, or is it a slog?
Never read it, difficult?
Oh, okay.
I just know the general plot.
Right. In the lecture on inducing egoism, he talked about, and I mentioned this last time because I observed it in my writing, like, refutation of an opponent is never the way to validate a principle. It's not like mathematics. Right. If X and Y, and if X is absurd, then Y. And so my question is, like he said, you need to know the causal relationships in order to
Yes.
prove something in philosophy. But I want to dig a little deeper into that, because I'm still thinking like, all right, well, let's say I say, well, obviously altruism is terrible, and I don't want to be altruistic towards God because there's no God, and I don't want to be altruistic to other people because then I suffer. So then egoism it is. Like, let's say, what's, like you could still say it's okay. It seems like all the others are absurd, then egoism. But does that mean have I at least shown that egoism is the proper principle to follow, or I've shown it, but I haven't shown how you follow it, or if I use this mathematical deductive method, which isn't applicable to philosophy, like what's wrong with that?
It'd be
In more detail
falsification. It's fine, you could falsify the one thing, but it can't demonstrate the positive assertion that egoism is correct.
Okay.
You just
Okay,
refute the individual conclusion. Say, oh, that one's thrown out, but that's all you did. You had to come up with a new one, just like falsification and pop. I mean, it's right to do that, but it doesn't give you the proof of a new conclusion. It only disproves a conclusion.
Okay, so it's sort of like you're not at the point, like you could say, well, egoism is the only one left over, but with that, it's still not enough, because you don't know if there might be some other thing you haven't thought about, right? You need induction to show you, okay,
Right.
this is it. Okay.
Or at least some way. At least some way to figure things out.
Right. Sort of like in mathematics, how they don't accept anything other than deduction as a form of proof, even though there may be overwhelming evidence. For example, there's a thing called the Goldbach hypothesis, and it's that every even number can be made up of a combination of two prime numbers. And if you look at all the even numbers, the starting even numbers, you can see you can make them out of primes and out of two primes. And you can keep doing this on and on and on, and you keep finding any even number you can create as a sum of two prime numbers, but there's no deductive proof for it. So they don't accept it as true, because they don't know if you get to some, I don't know, I'm assuming you get to some really big number, maybe it doesn't hold anymore. And so is it similar in the sense that in philosophy, in order to properly show something and be certain that there's no other alternative, you have to then inductively prove it? If you just do reductio ad absurdum, all you've shown is that two things are false, but you haven't necessarily shown that the third one is the definite thing you should pursue. Am I getting the right direction?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I mean, at best, any refutation is just, well, at worst, it would be just you're just making the person realize that they can't make their case. As for yourself, refutation doesn't give you new premises or doesn't demonstrate, is that's what I'm trying to suggest.
What if I showed that there were I'm speculating here without proper context, but I'm just giving it a go. Like, what if I showed that the only alternative, and I proved that the only possible alternatives for guiding principles of behavior are egoism and altruism? Then I reductio ad absurdum altruism. Does that make egoism true? Or am I already, by even showing that those are the only possible alternatives, have I already actually gone through some induction to show egoism as the right one?
I mean, there really were only two options. You'd be right, but I would still question if they really were the only two.
Right.
Not many things are just that one or the other.
Right.
I mean, some things are, so you could get to that point. Okay. If you could demonstrate that there are two options.
Okay.
The law of excluded middle. But if you can't do that, then yeah, at best you could only refute. Refutation is just denying the conclusion. So if you only have two conclusions, you deny one is left. But if you have like 10, of course, you still have nine other conclusions to refute.
Okay. So yeah, I guess you need to show that those are the only alternatives, and showing that requires induction, something like that.
Yes. Or you could say like, given the only knowledge we have, and these are like 5 possible arguments that work, and nobody can conceive of others, at least for the time being, this is the best conclusion to work from.
Right.
You say, I've disproved the 4 others, 1 is left, so it's best to operate by this one
Right.
until something else is discovered.
That's just applying statistics then,
More
because
or
you
less,
know the
but
other, something like
or-
that, but you don't know if there are others.
or the best inference, which is also valid to do, I think.
Yeah.
In science, you work with the best you have.
Yeah.
You don't just stop because you don't have the perfect knowledge.
Right. Preference for certain virtues. We lay no special value on the possession of virtue until we perceive its complete absence in our opponent. The first thing I thought of was virtue signaling, which I've heard used before as like,
Yeah.
kind of proudly showing that you are something like, but I don't know.
Similar.
It's like you're emphasizing. I do wonder if, all right, let me see. I'm going to try to think of some examples. I wonder if, okay, actually, if I don't know if this applies. If I'm a heterosexual male, I don't walk around saying I'm a proud heterosexual.
Yeah.
Or if I have green eyes, I don't walk around saying I'm a proud green-eyed person.
Yeah.
That's bizarre. But, or if I'm let's say I'm what do you call someone who eats both meat and plants? Is there I know there's
Omnivore.
Omnivore. Oh, they eat both. Okay, so but most people don't walk around saying I'm a proud omnivore. I'm the greatest omnivore there is. But a lot of people who are just herbivores, they walk around like, with shirts saying herbivore, vegan, and they have like necklaces that say vegan and all kinds of. I've seen that. So maybe that's a cat. I don't know.
I think it's similar to that. It's hard to say if this is negative or positive. I think it's just an observation. Yeah. To perceive complete absence. Yeah, I think people give special value when they think they're the only one that has it. I think that does happen.
Yeah, but you could say the same about materials as well. Like, why is gold valuable? Because it's rare. It's got the special value because it has certain rare properties that no other materials have.
Yeah.
Why one contradicts. We often contradict an opinion, while actually it is only the tone with which it was advanced that we find disagreeable.
I think I've done that before. Like, something's contrarian just because the way somebody said it. Like, I might realize it later, but it's like just the way they said it. I didn't actually disagree.
I think
or people do
I
it
definitely
to me.
would have done that. Yeah.
People do it to me, but like they don't really disagree. They're nitpicking at, or they just don't like me even sometimes. In some instances.
But then I don't know if it's what is it about the way then? Isn't it deeper than the way? Isn't it the implication? I don't know. What is it about the method?
I think some
or the
people
way, the style
are just emotional about it.
Okay.
I mean, they should see the connection between what I say and the meaning of it. They're not separate. I mean, but it's not like the tone really changed what I'm saying.
Well, what is the tone adds like? Well, okay, let me try to think of what the tone might add. The tone might add a sense that they're superior to you as a person. So that's one thing. And then, so what is it that you're doing? Maybe I'm speculating, I'm trying to guess at this. You're trying to find a way to battle that in a kind of passive aggressive way. I don't know, something like that, right?
Yeah, but then they argue with I agree, but then it's too bad they then argue with your arguments. Like, the actual argument is the person's character, if they're a good person. The actual disagreement isn't the arguments. I think that's what it is. Like you're kind of talking past the person.
I
Or
see.
you're not talking about the real issue. The real
Yeah.
issue is you don't like them. It's not the arguments.
Or you don't like the way they're behaving could be another.
Yeah, I mean they might be right, but it's easier to just argue against what they said than to go out and say something and condemn somebody or say something directly.
Right.
Sometimes people want to condemn someone without being direct. They want an excuse to yell at somebody. But
yeah, so that's like a
better just let
cheaper,
it
easier
go.
way to do it is just say, "Ha, you're wrong on this."
Yes. Or you just
Got
let
it.
it go. Let it go would be the best option. Like if you really don't like them, don't bother. It's not worth the time.
Well, I mean that's an extreme case. You definitely get cases where it's just the
Yes.
way something is said, and I guess what
Yeah.
is it? The kind of whatever's implicit. I don't know what the possibilities are, other than they might give off the idea that they're superior to you, which you think is unjustified, or something like that. But yeah, it makes me think of that quote by Rand in Ito at the end, where she talks about if men could introspect 1/10 as well as they could extrospect, it would be a race of giants. And so I wonder if there's the, like you can identify in yourself, okay, my reaction is not to the statement, but to the person. What am I identifying here actually that's going on?
Yes.
What do you make of this when he said, he did give some examples, I think, but I want to go deeper into it. Don't start looking for middle terms from which to deduce and then make observations for like a induction that you perform. Like just start, I think he meant just start reducing first. Don't look for any middle terms. Like what's the connection between what you're trying to say?
I'm not sure I understand that one.
Okay.
It seems to make sense to do. So I'm not sure what he means.
I need to review it. Let's just wrap up on another.
Yeah.
Actually, you know what? Let me ask you this. Do you know the argument from disagreement?
I mean, no.
The
What is
sophists
it?
had an argument. So sophists held a few things about against reason, and one of them, which I think is actually it's a good
Oh,
point.
that no one
And
agrees about it.
yeah, they're talking about, they've got Thales,
Oh.
everything is water, Heraclitus, everything is change.
Yeah.
No, everything is numbers. No, everything is atoms. And they're like, this is hopeless. Like if reason were actually effective at arriving at truth,
Yeah.
if it were a valid tool, we wouldn't have all this chaos. And so what would be it's actually it's a valid observation. And what would you say to them in that context? Like, I can't think of I could say we're capable of error. Reason is not infallible, but that doesn't seem very convincing. Like it's a very valid observation.
Being that they're sophist first, I would think about, well, what does it mean to disagree? They're trying to rely on your ambiguity in the word disagree. Like, oh, if we disagree, therefore we don't agree on anything. Like,
right.
Well, you also agree in some sense, probably. Because that's usually what they argue with the sophists, even back then. Just think about the terms. They always argued on the basis that the terms were ambiguous. So don't make them ambiguous, make them clear and distinct, and then you'll find the answer usually. So in this case, it would be like, well, there's fallibility, but we also agree that there's a method, that there is a way. Otherwise, no one would come up with methods. At least we all agree there's a method. So then we all disagree. No, we do agree in some sense.
That's good. I didn't think about that. It's funny that they were very intelligent, and they found all these terms that they could slide into an argument that would create all this chaos because they were ambiguous terms that people didn't clarify. I like that.
They
very
knew
interesting.
that explicitly. And Aristotle wrote that from all the Aristotle I've been reading. He goes into like arguing against sophists.
Yeah.
It's almost always like ambiguity is like the number one thing. They're always ambiguous. You defeat them by being clear yourself.
Right.
Or you make fun of them. Literally make fun of them.
Like
of the absurdity.
I heard about his argument, reduction to babbling.
Yes.
I
You
gotta get
meant
more into this at some point. This is very
it's not
interesting.
as pithy as you would think. It's babbling as in saying things that are reductive, almost like repeating yourself, like yeah, kind of like repeating yourself.
Yeah, I got it from the lectures. It's like,
But it's
well,
funny
do you know
though.
you exist? Did you say
Yeah.
anything? And they're like, it's highly probable. And then you keep asking, well, it's highly probable that it's highly probable, it's highly probable, and they just go into a
Yes,
corner. Yeah.
that would be babbling. Yes, play ourselves meaning. It's pretty funny.
I'll look forward to getting into it deeper.